go through the call to order. 10:04. And as to roll call, we have Gene Lawson, Sandy Bieber, Sturgis Dodge, and the chair, Hoyte Decker. Thank you, Joe. And we're awaiting Susan Wood, who did not indicate she wouldn't be here. So I'll note for the record when she arrives, if she arrives. My next item is to call for a motion for two sets of minutes, the first for March 6th and the second for June 5th. If I can get a motion and a second on that.
Mr. Chair, could you tell me whether these minutes that are being presented to the meeting
right in there
reflect comments that you received since you first circulated them to members of the committee?
They do not.
They don't reflect any comments?
Well, I'm sorry. Just take a look. I'm not sure.
Well, then I can't vote on it because I don't know if they've been modified with comments that were sent to you. I would have to go look.
So we'll defer.
Okay.
We can defer. Specifically, one or the other, June 5th, oh, you don't know. Okay. All right, we'll defer the approval of minutes for March 6th and June 5th for our next meeting. I've received no correspondence. I have no organizational issues to address unless somebody else does. And as to citizen comment, it doesn't seem like we have too many people here today, so I'm going to plow on through. To old business, and specifically the tree ordinance. And under that, we have two agenda items. The first is a status report. And I know Sturgis, you provided some input on that, and Sandy did as well. I would like to frame this in the context of this is my effort to produce what I hope will be a report to the Board of Commissioners at their July regular meeting. I believe it's scheduled for the 19th. And what I'm interested in here is simply to give them essentially what's in the memo itself, which is, which are the provisions we've looked at, which are the ones we still have to look at. With that in mind, I'm happy to discuss some of the comments that you made, but I'm going to note for the record that Susan Wood, our fifth member, has arrived. Good morning.
Good morning, guys. Sorry.
As to your comments, and I know there's some comments in there about the substance of some of these provisions, and I'm willing to discuss it, but my preference is to hold off until we approach these things for what I would call the second round, going through these things. And beyond that, I would only note that I have posted in attachment 5 my reworking of section 253.25, and it actually goes a little bit beyond what we discussed at our meeting. And I'll also note, and you'll get an opportunity to discuss it, that Sandy Bieber has provided a reworking of 253.38 and 39, and from my quick examination of it, it looks like it went a little bit beyond what we did at our June meeting.
So, well, I wasn't present during that discussion, but I watched the video. I would say it goes it went substantially.
And that's fine. That's fine. So anyway, with all that in mind, oh, I'm sorry. And did you have you had a provision? You had a provision in from the June meeting as well. I forget what it was, and whether you did you submit
I
something?
did. I
Okay,
sent
I
that.
missed it.
I sent that to you, and I sent it individually to each of the
Oh,
other
okay.
committee members.
I know I got some, hang on a second here.
And right now, I'm kind of,
Sturgis, you talking about that two-page document you sent to us?
2 pages?
I'm sorry, Sandy, I didn't hear you.
Are you talking about it was a two-page transmission?
It may have been, let me look. My filing system is somewhat inadequate, so I'm tracking down.
These are your dated 6/19.
Okay, which provision, which item in the code is it addressing?
Well, you talked about 25320, review of commissioners, 25336, administrative waivers. Is that the same document you're referring
I
to?
don't think so. It was just,
Yeah, I don't think so either.
just one section that
I got it.
Hoyte reminded,
Yeah.
prompted me
I'm
to
sure I got it either.
address.
I'm not
And
finding.
right now, I've got so much. Was it 258?
Oh, what I got from you was tree
Oh,
definitions.
Here it is. Well, you did get some tree definitions,
Yeah.
yeah. This was an insert. You asked me to insert it, and I inserted it on tree ordinance status July 3, attachment 1. And it's addresses 253, 20, let's see, 38, 24, and 26.
Okay.
And it talked about protected
Protected
trees.
trees,
And
okay.
it was, yeah, it was a
Sounds like
general-
good stuff. I don't
general
think I
type-
got it.
Okay.
I'm gonna
it's-
ask you to
it's
send
in-
it,
it's in
maybe
your
you could
email.
distribute, use.
Could you tell me when it was sent, Sturgis?
I'm sorry, I sent this on June 28th, 2019. Now, I only sent this to you, Hoyt,
Oh,
okay?
okay.
Good.
And I
I was
I
gonna
only
say,
sent it, this one, because, yeah, that, you asked me to insert it
Well,
attached to your 26.
I did?
Yeah, general criteria for determination of specimen trees, tree stands of historic trees.
All
So
right, I'm gonna ask you to send it again
Sure,
to me,
sure,
please.
I'll stick it on the top. of the
It sounds
file.
like I got it though, if I communicated with you.
Oh, you did prior.
Somehow it didn't get in my book
Okay.
here, so I'm sorry. Got it. All right, well, with that, if anybody has any comments, and I'm looking for more in the area of corrections or, omissions, identifying something that I may have left out for the status report itself. Again, not for the substance of the provisions themselves.
I was wondering, I wasn't quite sure because you, on today's agenda, kind of covered the whole waterfront in terms of
I
everything
did.
we've been doing. And I
Right.
knew that you hadn't scheduled enough time for us to talk about
Correct.
item by item. So
Correct.
I may have jumped to a conclusion that what we might be talking about today was sort of progress report and maybe a conversation about process. And, what I've been aware of as I've worked, on these items by items is how difficult it is to work on them in isolation from one another. And so I'm just kind of inviting maybe us to look at whether or not we might, my thought is, and this is, don't want to sound like a broken record, but my thought is what would make sense to me is to go back to the kind of original purpose and intent and goal. And
Well, you kind of said that at the last meeting, too.
yeah, to go back to that,
Right.
because, to me, there's some issues, there's several issues. I mean, I would love to see this thing written in plain English, for starters.
Mhm.
And right now, we're kind of just wordsmithing legalese, at least that's what it feels like. I'd also love to eliminate, inconsistencies, which I know we're all working on. But the thing to me that's the most critical thing is to have this be, whatever we come up with, something that actually matches reality and results in the goal, you know, the goal that was set. And I've been talking a little bit to Liz about, you know, how many, you know, to me it's a math problem. How many trees can you fit on a lot, and how many of what kind of trees? And, you know, so to me, I kind of see us, I would love to see us kind of go back to the goals and then look and review each section to see whether or not it satisfies the goals, and maybe have Liz help us, because she's the one who's in the trenches and is actually
Sure.
doing this.
Well, I think
'Cause,
as I've experienced, she's
Yeah.
pretty much been doing that.
Right.
At least with
Yeah.
respect to the work that I've been doing with
Yeah,
hers.
I'd
I
like
feel
to,
very good about that.
yeah, I'd like to though really get down to that math.
So
Yeah.
let me answer you this way,
Sure.
because I think I mean, I'm happy to have you be kind of like an ombudsman or you know, a fact checker, or,
Got it.
you know, how you might approach it, so that when we go back over these things, I don't think I want to start over again.
I hear you, I hear you.
But I think,
Yeah.
you know, when we go to round two,
Right,
I mean,
Kinda look at
it should be
Yeah.
in your
yeah,
field of vision that
right.
we're gonna try and
The
achieve those. I mean, yeah, I think,
Yeah,
with all due respect, I've got two lawyers over here,
Got it.
and I value their presence on this thing. And I think the bottom line
as
is
well.
we need to
I
have
as well.
something that's legally sufficient, so.
Definitely.
But that doesn't mean we can't still have something that
Yeah.
it's plain English or,
The other thing
At
is
least reasonably
the order, I've been thinking about the order in which we're addressing them. And, you know, like definitions, really the definitions flow from the rest of the text.
indeed. And
So, you know, you can't,
we're gonna have a little discussion on that today.
Yeah.
I just wanna introduce the topic,
got it.
but my intention is to hold that until basically the very end.
Yeah.
Because it's gonna flow from all
Right.
these other things that
Right.
we've got here, so.
May I just raise one more point?
Sure.
While I'm on a roll.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I'm imagining that the mayor and commissioners, one of whom is in the audience, will be looking at is kind of what we're gonna do next. And I'm wondering.
What we're gonna do next?
Yeah, you know, what next? And I guess what I'm wondering is whether the committee has formulated a way to sort of maybe address section by section and sort of put a stamp on, like, provisionally this is done, kind of? Because it feels like we're, in
Well,
some ways, trying to do everything at the same time.
The end of the chapter that's called tree ordinance will be a document that we put forward to the Board of
know.
Commissioners.
I guess what
And
I'm.
then,
Yeah.
well, I'm gonna answer your question.
Sure.
And then, we do have an outstanding code element that we started with at the very beginning,
Right.
which is the zoning code. And Gene Lawson unwittingly took responsibility for that. He didn't know anything at that point, so. But no,
Gotcha.
in fact, I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday, and they were talking about low-hanging fruit. Because the zoning code does have, and Gene, who can speak for himself, has identified some of these things.
Right.
And as I've said several times, this will be like the fourth time I've said this in a public meeting, and that is, the zoning code needs professional help.
I agree.
But
Yeah.
beyond that,
Yeah.
since the inception of this committee,
Right.
I have received, now some of it's zoning, some of it's trees, but I have received about a dozen inquiries, letters, whatever, and people have come in and spoken with us. So I've created a little record of some of these other issues
Are those
that we could put on our to-do list.
low-hanging fruit with the tree
Well,
code, or is that what you're looking
I don't want to give you examples, but there's they run the gamut. There's some pretty simple stuff and there's some pretty complex stuff out there, so. But anyway, I intend to put some kind of a paper out when we're moving into the next chapter, so.
Okay.
So, Susan, would you like to comment on the status report?
I actually agree with Julie.
Okay,
Julie,
I like that.
me?
I mean, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Ms.
I'm
Sturgeon.
sitting in her chair.
Yeah, and Julie, what Julie had said originally, so.
True that.
Julie and, yeah. No, I agree with,
Okay.
what Julie said originally, I agree with what she said now, I agree with, you know, the, not starting at the bottom of the code and working backwards. I think we need to start at the top and work down.
All right, gentlemen. Jean, or Sandy?
But I'm coming back. Julie basically said exactly the same.
Got it.
Well, the one thing that I just want us to keep in mind is whenever we're going through this, at some point, we do need to turn around and go back through it to make it consistent, because going through and changing anything is going to have an
Excellent
effect
point.
on everything else.
Excellent point.
Yeah.
So what
We need to create that balance.
we go through and do the substantive changes, then we have to go back through and make sure that everything we've done makes sense.
Excellent point,
Internally.
thank you. All right, Sandy.
I think in terms of reporting to the Board of Commissioners that this committee has looked at a number of sections of the tree code is an appropriate status report. But I don't think we can say that we have actually agreed on any revision, that we have agreed really on a central thrust.
A central thrust?
Thrust,
Uh-huh.
mission, whatever.
Goal.
In terms of how you want to form
Yeah.
it. And I'm very sensitive to the point that Jean is making,
Right.
because this code is so inconsistent in terms of terminology, definitions. Something will show up in one section and then it's over in another section, and you wonder, are these supposed to be operating independently or is it the same thing? And all of that needs to be brought together. And it may be that whenever, and you're taking the lead here, Hoyte, and we are following your lead, but whenever it is that you decide that we have looked at the whole code and now we have to do something about this look, we should go through it and figure out some systematic, organized way to approach, either in sections or chunks or whatever, to get this thing drafted to present to somebody, because we haven't done really any of that. We have some good pieces that are well done, but we haven't agreed on them.
Right.
And I just think that we need to sort of bring some of these things to resolution.
And I agree with that. So, and again, I will state that I am open to suggestions if we want to change course or change technique or however you want to describe it. But my intention is, unless somebody persuades me otherwise, just to move forward. We've got like 12 or 13 of these provisions that are left, not including definitions. And it would be my plan to start going through those at the beginning at our next meeting, provision by provision. So your
I would say,
reaction to
Mr.
that?
Chairman, on that, we have three main provisions that I think are really difficult provisions.
Okay.
That we really haven't attached. One is the whole administrative appeal to the Park and Shade Tree Commission. One is the appeal to the Board of Commissioners, and one is the whole mitigation section.
Okay.
And they're interrelated.
Yes, they are.
I think that Julie gave us, before she left the committee, a very good working draft on the administrative appeal to Park and Shade Tree Commission, that
Great.
with a little bit of work, we could really have that in final place. But I think that this gets to the heart, I think, of Sturgis's comments and others, that when you're talking about mitigation, the mitigation provision makes absolutely no sense in terms of there's no clarity at all about when mitigation is required, how you calculate mitigation. The Planning Commission in 2014 had a very different approach, which I think was at least in principle, a much more rational approach. That apparently went nowhere. I don't know if that's because the city didn't like it or they just never got around to looking at it. And then the whole question of appeal to the Board of Commissioners is a very bizarre provision. It is the only provision I'm aware of in our entire city code where the ability to appeal is any person as opposed to either an aggrieved person or an applicant, number one. And number two, the whole appeal process is not a matter of right. In other words, if you appeal, you get to be heard, but it is totally discretionary with the Board of Commissioners, which also makes no sense under administrative procedures.
Okay.
So those are three
Yeah.
very difficult sections that we still have to tackle.
And I appreciate that. So, first of all, we've done some work. Again, I think Julie's effort is very good. And you've taken that over, and we've had a discussion about that.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, we
but
discussed,
I
but
know,
we
I know.
haven't resolved.
And we've also addressed, recent history suggests that you're spot on with your concerns about the appeal to the Board of Commissioners. So I think, although we've done some work on that already, I think there's some more substantive work that we need to do. As to mitigation, 25335, I have been working on that. Indeed, I've had a meeting not that long ago with the city arborist, and I've actually created a clean draft, and I'm hoping that I'll have another meeting at some time in the not too distant future on this issue. Hello. Thank you. So, I mean, your points are well taken, and I agree with you. And I think as to those three things, there's a lot more work to be done, but I think we're ready to move forward and do that.
I think my only point is that if you're presenting to the commissioners and you're giving a status report, you need to be clear that we have had meaningful discussions, we've had public input,
Right?
which
Yep.
is very important.
Yep, okay.
And we continue to go through these issues and really raising some very fundamental points with respect to the tree code. But it isn't like we are at a stage where we can say, okay, here's the first chunk for you commissioners to look at. We're not there. I mean, we're so not there that we haven't even made a general decision as to whether the tree code, which is currently divided into 2 articles, ought to be one single code, which is...
Actually, I did make that statement.
No,
a few
we
months ago.
haven't decided,
I
I
hear you.
said.
I
We've
hear you.
discussed, we have not
I hear you.
decided.
I've addressed it. So, indeed, this is good stuff, fodder for, reworking a document, which I intended to do anyway, to address it to the Board of Commissioners. But I will incorporate some, if not all, of the suggestions you've just made, and as I usually do, I will circulate it so that I can get feedback from you. So we'll get on that straight away. Okay.
Could I just make a comment? Something that, as Sandy was talking, came to my mind is that, you're talking about administrative appeals. And I'm just kind of looking at some things that maybe could be pulled out and addressed that really, to me, could be addressed separate from the rest of the intent and purpose of the code. And one is the whole administrative appeal process. The other might be penalties and violations.
And do what with it now?
Well, I'm just kind of saying, look at it. I mean, one of the things that Jean is saying, and that I'm also saying, is that this code, it has to be consistent. It has to be consistent all the way through, or it doesn't make sense. But I'm thinking some things that, in my mind, and correct me if this doesn't make sense, that kind of stand alone are the appeals and the penalty and violation sections. Just like Jean is kind of looking at things that could be decriminalized in the zoning code. To me, those are kind of separate from trees.
Are you, okay, so
You know what I'm
are you
saying?
suggesting
So-
we take that out of the
Well,
tree ordinance?
no, not at all. I'm just saying that that's, in terms of low-hanging fruit, if you can do that. I don't like that phrase, because it often trips people up. People think it's low-hanging, and then it turns out to be not. But
This is true.
those are things I think that could be addressed with, separately from trying to get everything consistent. When you get to mitigation, to me, you're more back into the whole goals of the code and, you know, what's gonna be your end result kind of deal. So that's a little more complex in my thinking. I don't, anybody have any reaction to that from the law end of the table? Sandy or Jean? Does that
It's the
sound, I
legal,
mean,
it's the legal.
the legal end of the table, I mean, does that make sense, what I'm saying, or does that sound
Go ahead, Gene.
wrong to you?
Well, I think part of it has to do with the consistency. The appeals process doesn't work if we don't have a consistent code. Because generally speaking,
Yeah,
if something is appealed to the Board of Commissioners, they look at it on the record only. And if they're not looking at the record in light of a consistent code, they have nothing to do.
but what about the process, Jean? Do you think the process, though, could be reviewed without having all the other tree stuff consistent?
Well, it depends on whether we want the Board of Commissioners reviewing the process or reviewing the substance.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the process, because it's, you know, it's just a thought.
Well, interestingly, according to Commissioner Mills, in a statement he made a couple of meetings ago, I have had the only case of an appeal to the Board of Commissioners in the last decade or two. And it involved lots at the end of the boardwalk that were being partitioned, which the Planning Commission turned down, and the appeal was to the Board of Commissioners.
From this, in the zoning code you're talking about?
It had to do with zoning code,
Okay,
yes.
okay.
But it also was a situation where when we got to the appeal, it was for the board to look at the way things were written and the consistency it had within the code itself and make a decision. And they made a decision overturning the Planning Commission. And it was really weird because it had to do with two lots that were on the boardwalk that were facing Prospect Street, and the owner wanted to just turn them
South end, yeah,
to
I
face,
remember.
to face the boardwalk. The boardwalk, which at the time I hopefully convinced them was a street that had never been paved, but it was on the plat. It was on the plat and it was there. And it also created a little bit of a problem because there were people claiming land on the beach side of the boardwalk, which they could never have done if there was really a street there. That part has never been resolved, matter of fact.
So, were you expressing concern about the process of an appeal to the Board of Commissioners with the zoning code?
Now, in that case, the process worked
I mean,
fine.
is that a potential model for us to replicate here?
Well, I'm not so sure.
Or is it a bad example?
I don't think it could be a whole lot different because the process is the process. In that case, it was very simple because they had to make a decision about whether or not there was a street there or whether there wasn't. If there was a street there, the appeal took care of itself. And the lots could be partitioned, which is the way they ruled ultimately. But with the tree ordinance, I'm concerned about whether or not we're asking the Board of Commissioners to get involved with something that should be beneath them and should stay beneath them.
Oh, in terms of an appeal process?
The appeal should be a last resort. And of course, once the Board of Commissioners has made up their mind, the only appeal process from that point on is in the courts. And as we saw recently, the courts look down on what Rehoboth does in terms of its review process. And with respect to Baymart, the court didn't listen to the appeal. They sent it back to the commission, back to the city. We don't need that. And I don't think we want the Board of Commissioners doing that. We want them to be in a position to make a decision on substantive matters. The procedural stuff, the courts can deal with later if there's a procedural problem. But
But I think taking the parallel of the zoning area and taking it to the tree code.
Yes.
The zoning area has at least a fairly well-developed appellate process. They even have their own rules of practice, the Board of Adjustment. The Park and Shade Tree Commission doesn't really do what the statute says it's supposed to do.
Correct.
And as I think we have discussed in prior meetings, if it were up to me, and I actually drafted some of this and circulated to you all in advance of this meeting, I think that the provisions relating to the Park and Shade Tree Commission should require certain qualifications for members on that and continuing education and training so that they actually know the tree code, they know something about trees, they understand something about how it relates to the mission of the city to be a tree city. And if you have on a parallel track, if you have something that goes from City Arborist Building and Licensing to Park and Shade Tree Commission, and then, if necessary, to the commissioners, then you have a parallel track like you have in the zoning area. And that's what I would prefer to see, but you need to have it with proper procedures in place which don't exist, and proper qualifications for people on that board which don't exist. The people may have those qualifications, I don't know.
True.
But we don't have that embedded
But it needs to be
as part of
formalized.
it. And in this particular case, I think that, and I think Sturgis, you may, or Susan, one of you originally raised the whole point about training,
I did.
which,
Yeah.
which I think is critically important.
And I know, I sent a comment to you, to everybody, that I think
It's in there.
did that, and there's a reference to the code for the city of Atlanta. And Atlanta, their Parks and Shade Tree, or whatever they call it, has 12 people on it. And it has to be, there has to be an arborist, there has to be a landscape, I mean, you know,
Yeah, it's
they're
a little-
very, I mean, 12 people is above and beyond.
They're a little bigger than we are.
They are quite bigger,
Yeah.
but they're very specific. They're dictating the composition. And they also talk about the rules, you know, the guiding
The principles.
thought, the
Guiding
principles on
principles.
which decisions are made, and, you know, which I think I included in those comments to you.
The problem here is if you go to the Park and Shade Tree Commission meetings, hearings, whatever they're called, what you find is that they are perplexed because they don't understand the code, because the code makes no sense to them, the tree code. And they turn to their council, and the council says, well, it's ambiguous, and there ought to be a way for members of the public to be able to read the code and understand what it means, and they can't. So they're hamstrung for starters. They can't even do their job.
Can I ask a question? Two lawyers here in the group, and I know that you have worked with the city code, not just the tree ordinance, probably quite a bit in the past years, but
That would be
from
true.
a looking down the future, I mean, right now we're doing the tree ordinance. I'm going to be assuming that there's going to be something that's going to come up when this is done, where we have to look at the siding ordinance and where we have to look at the, the building ordinance, and where we have to look at each section of the code. From your experience, having dealt with this over the years, if you go to the code on parking, okay, the section of the code that relates to parking, is it laid out the same as the code for the trees? Is it laid out the same as, in other words, if you as a layman were going to the code and you wanted, does it start with, this is the title, this is what this section of the code is about, these are the definitions, is it fairly consistent, or has it just been added on to so much? I mean, I only deal with really 2 or 3 sections of it, but overall, and the only reason I'm asking this is because I think it goes back to what Sturgis said, and what I said a while ago, that, I'm going back to basics because I'm not an attorney, I'm a basic person. If I were trying to figure something out, I would, just like writing a paper in school, you start with the goal. Remember, they used to make you turn in, what are you writing about? And then this is your outline, where are you gonna go from there? And then step 2 is, okay, now let's fill in a little more information and hand it in again. I hate to make it sound so basic and so kindergartenish, but that's my level of doing things and getting things done. And, we've made certain progress in certain sections, but I think before we start putting them back in anywhere, I think this may be a really good time, considering, I mean, let's face it, the tree ordinance thing's been going on for years now, so we're not delaying the process too much, of maybe getting that format, so when we do come to next questions going on, it's the same. I mean, if I'm building a house, I need to know, what building is, what zoning is, what trees are. You can go and you can see, and the city's done that. They have a plan. They have, goals that everybody, and if we could just maybe start there, because like I said, I just think it's so many things. Once we get something close, you turn the page and it goes, well, that doesn't work with what's over here, and now we got to start again. So I kind of feel like we're just constantly backpedaling, and I'll be honest with you, I get completely lost with all these emails and everything going back and forth, because I'm not even sure we get halfway through a meeting and I kind of get confused on what we started on even here. So that's just a thought. I don't know. There's professionals that write codes. I was just kind of doing a little research here, and I did it last week as well on templates type for things. And I don't know if maybe, is there, Sandy, through the law school that you have access to, are there templates for these things? I mean, are you trained in code provision? Is there a way to start? Is there a way to lay them out? And does the Rehoboth Code, not just this tree section, but all the sections? I just think, one, it would make our job easier down the road as well, for jumping to the next time somebody says, I want to, change, I can't even think of examples at this point, the way penalties are assessed for jaywalking. How does that, where does that go, and how does it fit in the code versus the regular laws in the state of Delaware? You know what I'm saying? Does that make any sense? Anybody?
Yeah, one of the things that I think we need to start off with, and we've mentioned this before, is whether the code and derived from the code, the appeals process is going to be subjective or objective. Right. Are we going to set forth a set of criteria that are the criteria that are going to be met, or it doesn't work? Or are we going to set up certain limits within which there's discretion?
Right. And we're talking right now about the tree committee, but that would also apply to the planning committee and the housing committee and all the other committees. I mean, is there a point where you, doing the tree ordinance, just get to the section of civil criminal penalties and write C Article 12, civil and criminal penalties, and it's pretty much the same for no matter what we're talking about, somebody with a sign violation or somebody with a not mowing their lawn violation or whatever it is, instead of putting that into what we're doing, just get to the tree part and write C, Article 4, civil and criminal penalties, period. Procedures for dealing with. Does that make?
Taking your last point first.
Can you do it that way? I don't know.
That was actually part of the email I sent around yesterday, which was just trying to sort out between two sections where you should have penalties and sanctions, and another section where you talk about inspection and compliance, because it was all mishmashed. But that aside, literally 11 months ago at this committee, we adopted a statement about how we were going to work with the Delaware Law School at Widener. Hoyte and I both had very positive discussions with the professor who led that clinic and was willing to provide his law students and give them assignments, and I am certain that if we said to him, among other things, can someone do a paper for us on how do you approach the drafting of a code? How do you, but we were cut off by doing this because there was a certain view on this committee that these were not qualified enough people, and this was not a qualified enough law school. I very much disagree with that. I think we missed a big opportunity. We may be able to recapture that opportunity, but that would have been a great way to proceed.
We could just start with an outline. I mean, I would just feel so much more accomplished if we could start with an outline and get a title. Just give us a title.
We're not doing something that's never been done before.
Yeah.
So there are models, and law schools are great places to use their research capabilities to say, here's a good model of an approach. Here's a good structure for a code before you even start to fill it in. Exactly what you were saying, Susan. Here's your statement of objective. Here we broke it down into whatever it is, tree planting, tree maintenance, tree removal, tree mitigation, sanction, inspection and compliance, penalties and whatever. And then you have a nice
But it's
code.
consistent throughout all the sections of the code.
Well, you're not
And
necessarily
what
gonna
we-
get that because of some of them, I mean,
Right.
they all go in different directions.
Right, this is true, but what
Yeah.
we've done here is certainly not been a waste because it can get put in once we get the format and then we at least have something that has a blank spot. It's like, okay, we filled this part. I mean, Liz has been sitting here now for an hour and a half or an hour, however long, and, you know, we're gonna get one section and then we're liable to stick it in somewhere and go, oh, this doesn't work with the other section, and now she's gotta come back again. So I'm just, again, I'm more inclined to get back to the beginning and maybe start with what we have as a basis for, I mean, all the work that we've already done on the civil criminal penalty and the definitions and, you know, mitigation, which again, I'm not even so sure we need that section. So, just a thought.
I'm just kind of wondering, I'm not, I don't disagree with you about using a law school, but I'm kind of wondering if we even have to go that far. Because you're kind of saying, this isn't the first time this has been done, and I'm just kind of wondering if there's not something just in the public domain that says, what parts of the code are, if there's just something, an outline. I have a hard time believing there isn't such a thing.
There is, but they're
Yeah.
all, again, it's, the thing is, unless you're looking at a brand new development or brand new city that's just been incorporated, everybody has the same problem Rehoboth has. They started with something and then they fill it in. So if you look at some of the major areas, and at some point everybody just throws in the towel and says, we got to start over. This has been added on to a million times. But the newer communities start out with a plan, but it's easier because there's no precedent. There's nothing to change. So
But I'm just wondering, where that template comes from. I mean, obviously. it
well,
doesn't
I think
come
the
out.
law students could probably provide the information.
It's like so many things,
Might
whether
be
you're
online.
talking about a standard lease or
Right,
an
exactly.
acquisition
I'm thinking
agreement,
way
or they all have structures. I mean, you start off with
Yeah.
a statement of the purpose of and you can have a section on definitions, and as I said, then you get into the substantive provisions, and if one of them is, tree planting, if another is tree maintenance, if another is tree removal, if another is mitigation, if another is inspections and compliance, I mean, it's pretty straightforward to sort that out, block that out, excuse me, and then take this code and throw the different sections under those headings for starters, and then figure out what you really want it to say, whether you want the sections as they're currently drafted, as modified, or totally rewrite the whole thing.
But what would happen if we tried that as a committee? What if that was a 1 or 2
In the
hour?
context of the tree
1 or
ordinance?
2 hour meeting to take the tree ordinance, start with one of them. Things can be moved around later, but start with one and go, okay, are these, because again, that Article 1 and Article 2 street, I'm not even so sure, that's very confusing, I think, to people. When you're looking up an ordinance on trees, it should be an ordinance on trees, not Article 1, street tree, public tree, it's confusing, it's very confusing.
So I need to take a time out. I'm sorry, I'm enthralled with this conversation, and we can continue it, but I think we owe it to the city arborist to give her an opportunity to comment on this status memo. And we also have now somebody in the audience if they want to comment as well. But I'm happy to go back to this discussion. I think it has value. So, but if I may, let me get us back on track for just a few minutes here, and maybe we can push through that and have a quick conversation about definitions, and then get back to that conversation, and ultimately move on to this zoning code issue. So, if I may, Liz, if there was something you wanted to comment about.
Not unless you have any specific questions for me. There's nothing that
Not at this point, no.
nothing that stood out to me that I
Okay.
have to say my piece or
Okay.
anything like that.
Could I ask Liz a question?
Sure you can.
I would just something that might be helpful, at least for me going forward, is any information you have about how much natural space on a lot could be
Okay, yeah.
required for
Yeah.
different sizes of trees and or species of
I'm
trees.
happy to make, you know,
Well,
if we can get them done, let's get it here.
in relation to placement of buildings, I don't know if that, I don't really have anything off the top of my mind, but, I have stuff related to soil volume,
So that's-
or
that's-
like tree pits.
That's what I'm interested in, soil volume for different species and,
Yep, I have it, they
Okay.
usually, yeah, because you wanna plant it where there's enough soil volume to live, so.
yeah, if you could share that with us, that would be cool.
Yeah, I think I have a couple of like graphs based on the species size, but generally I wanna say you assume a 3-foot depth.
Right.
Any deeper doesn't make a difference.
Right.
And then you want about 65, and this is for smallest tree, so like a redbud. Then you want about 65 square feet on top for a happy, healthy tree. Now you look around and we have tree pits that are 3 by 3 or whatever, but that would be the ideal
Okay.
for longevity and health and aesthetics
Yeah,
and
if-
housing complex.
Yeah, I mean, if you.
Could you say that, I'm sorry, Liz, can you go a little more slowly?
Well, in relation to tree pits, you generally, your minimum size, you really
But
want.
this is tree pits in the context of planting a tree.
Yes,
Right,
like,
okay.
think like Rehoboth Avenue or future streetscapes, stuff like that.
Well, it could even be private property.
Yeah,
Well, it doesn't really deal with the, relation of planting a tree near like a building, so it doesn't really take that into context, like, pruning branches or foundations and stuff like that. But I guess you could kind of extrapolate it from there if we're thinking sidewalk, pushing up, that much different than a foundation. Sidewalks would be worse, really. But you generally, assuming a 3-foot depth of soil volume, you want about an 8 by 8, so somewhere around 65
Area around where the,
square feet on top, yeah.
for a small tree.
so
Yeah, for a small.
What about a
Liz,
medium
isn't that
or
really,
large?
I'm sorry,
I don't have it
but this is, Liz, isn't that, I mean, you're speaking about that in the context of its impact on whether it will disrupt a sidewalk, for example, or a street or whatever, and you said it could
Well-
actually be extrapolated to deal with house foundations, but I see a more fundamental thing too here, which may be for another discussion, but if you're talking about, that's how you get a really healthy tree to grow
Yeah.
and to prosper, then getting back to this whole thing about mitigation, we have to think about if you take a tree down, you're not gonna plant a multiple of trees, which are gonna be in those 3 by 3 foot sections when you really need 8 by 8.
Exactly, and that's what
And
we
that's
were
part of-
last week was saying,
No,
can we just
I-
have 3 or 4 trees
Well,
required?
no, this gets back to the
Yeah.
planning commission's whole approach to mitigation
Yes.
back 5 years ago. But I think it's a
Enter-
really interesting point.
Once we start grouping plantings and you take into account adjacent open yard space, like interconnected root systems, they're not gonna say need 1,000 square feet of soil each because they're gonna share root space. So like I said, the information I have is more tree pit related, single tree, but I mean, it would be at least a decent baseline.
That would be great if you could get that for small, medium, and large trees. I mean, one of the things the planning commission tried to do in their 2014 and again 2016 was to ask that the 3 trees all be shade trees, which could reach a height of 30 feet. I think it could be argued that there's probably not room, and given our current building, code, to support that. But there are formulas for how much actual feet of earth, which may not conform to a gold standard drip line, but still be adequate. And I think anything we write should take the math into account, and not tell people that they need to do something they can't do that isn't going to be helpful to the tree or isn't going to satisfy the city's goal or express goal that we preserve our unique wooded seaside character. So I would love to have that from Liz.
Yeah, I mean, there's room for 3 trees on a property,
Yeah.
soil wise.
Right. But what kind, how large trees, how many of what kind, and, you know, do we want to look with the goal, do we want to extrapolate what kind of trees are actually going to be more valuable to the city and to the property owner and to the environment, et cetera,
Yeah,
et
I
cetera?
mean, I don't think the soil is really your limiting factor in private property tree plantings. I think it's more the proximity to structures than
Yes.
anything. Or trees growing into neighboring properties.
I mean, one thing just kind of related to this, the current tree code disallows the use of a lot line tree in the formula. You can't count that.
For some purposes, but not others.
No
No,
purpose.
no
I mean, you
other
still have to get a
purpose.
permit, but.
You have to get a
There
permit
are-
to take it out, but you can't count it as, you can't share with your neighbor half of that tree in your tree count.
Not for density,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
it does
Right.
count for other,
Exactly.
it does count for other purposes because it is not excluded from other provisions of the code, the tree code. I'd have to go back and look at my notes,
Okay,
but I've gone
I'm
through
not
that.
sure about that, but I'm just kind of thinking that's something we could look at, whether or not people could share a lot line tree in some
I
way.
think this is exactly the sort of thing that we were talking about earlier, that it's gonna be difficult for an appeal process because what you're talking about is partly discretionary.
Well, it
Or-
may or may
or
not be,
subjective.
depending on how we write it. I mean, we can write it to be discretionary or not,
But if we don't, then
yeah.
how do you take into account all these inner root things and stuff that she was talking about? That's something that you can't,
Well, you're right, the discretion could be the arborist, whether the arborist thinks that would work for the health of the tree or preserve. Is that what you're thinking?
well, it's an interesting thought, but I think that would be something that would be asking for trouble. If we put all that power in one person who can change. You know, they leave and somebody else comes in
It's
and the entire,
something though
Basis.
that we've considered.
right.
I think, Hoyte, you and I have talked before about the problem of relying too much on judgment, not just for what was said, but also the fact the more, we'll say, like gray area there is, the more you'll be challenged. If it straight up says this is not allowed or this is allowed, then there's not as much challenge to that. Now, if it says the arborist has discretion to allow this tree species, I'm gonna have people constantly pushing for things. So there is a line at which you need discretion and flexibility, like approving planting plans for, allowing, I think right now it says something about adequate rooting and crown space allowed for the health of the tree. But there are some that we just can't have.
So when you are in a situation where you're exercising your discretion,
Such
is
as.
it, well, I'm not gonna get into an example, but what I'm gonna say is, would you be relying on references such as ANSI or whatever some of these other association bodies are that provide the background to the type of issues that you're addressing?
Well, it would be relying on professional, I mean, without an example, I can't really tell you, but you would rely on professional knowledge, whether that incorporated ANSI or, scientific research about root space volume.
Well, okay, so the root space,
Yeah.
just go with that.
Mhm.
And I mean, aren't there ANSI provisions that address that sort of thing, that you would then be able to say, okay, based on, no, okay, all right. All right. Jean, did you want to, you good? Okay, so you're satisfied or no further comments from that? So, I'm gonna note for the record that the Mayor Coons is in attendance, and if Mayor, you're interested in offering any comments? No comments, all right, thank you. All right, so, what I'd like to do next, and I'm quite happy to go back to this earlier conversation that we had, but what I would like to do next is spend a limited amount of time to discuss or introduce the topic of definitions, and we've received some comments from both Sandy and Sturgis on these issues, and so I'm happy to receive input from you on the issues that we've already addressed, public tree, whatever, street tree, all that business. But I'd like the focus, the focus be emphasized on the ones that we haven't addressed yet. So why don't you go ahead first, Sturgis, and give us some.
What are we, okay.
I'm using, I produced a document which is in your packet here.
Okay.
I'm not sure where it is, but it identifies the 4 or 5 definitions that we've already discussed. And then it just has a copy of all the other definitions that are in the current code. So, and you had sent us a set of comments.
Are you talking about this document, review of tree ordinance definitions?
No, sir. It's a separate document. Hang on, where's my stuff here? Probably gonna be.
You gave all these attachment numbers.
Yeah, it should be at the end of this. Here, it's this document here in your packet, review of tree ordinance definitions. And I think it's probably gonna be the last, I'm sorry, forgive me. With all that handwriting.
You just don't like all my markings.
Exactly. So it's the last
Okay.
set of
If
documents.
we're here,
pages.
I would love, since our city arborist is here, for her to educate me. I will not, I'm sure everybody else already knows this, but educate me again. One of the things that I struggle with is this whole notion of caliper and diameter breast height, and when one is used versus another. And aren't they actually the same measurement, but they're just used at different heights from the ground or something? And so I'm in, if you talk about, as Susan said, trying to make things easier for the public to get, is there some standard approach here? Can you explain to us are there really different substantive applications of the measurement of caliper, which is subject to ANSI standards, the diameter of a young tree to be planted shall be measured at 6 inches above the ground. And when the tree's caliper exceeds 4 inches, it measured at 4 inches above the ground, versus diameter at breast height, the diameter of a tree measured at 4.5 feet above the ground as defined by ISA standards. I'm lost. I know what they are, but I don't understand when you use one, when you use the other, why you have both.
Okay.
And
so
is there a
there's-
simple way to deal with all this?
There are 2 different separate applications. One is nursery, one is arboriculture. They're 2 different fields, okay?
And
So-
caliper is nursery, right?
So if I call up Smith's Nursery and say I want a 2-inch caliper red bud, they're gonna send me a red bud measured 2 inches diameter, right? That's 6 inches off the ground.
Right.
Okay? Now, if I go out and say I'm writing up tree pruning specifications for a client, say I'm in tree sales, I work for my previous job, okay? I'm gonna write up for purposes of, say, fertilization or other chemical treatments or for the crews, because they're going without me, I'm gonna say DBH. 27-inch DBH Southern Red Oak. DBH is gonna be 4.5 feet. So if I'm calculating a fertilization injection treatment, it's DBH.
So, but slow down. So you're saying basically to that crew, unlike what you said to the nursery,
Yep.
I want you to go find this tree that at 4.5 feet above the ground is 27 inches in diameter.
Yep.
Versus to the nursery, I want to buy a tree that at 12 inches above the ground is 2 inches in diameter.
6 inches.
6 inches above the ground, right, nursery. 6
Because
inches.
at,
At 4 inches it goes to the, all right.
at 4.5 feet, a nursery tree is gonna start having branches sometime. Like,
Right.
it might be a half an inch
No,
around.
no, I get it. So this whole,
Or say a tree inventory. We do a tree inventory for
If-
street trees.
right, but if
I
we're
have to
talking
use-
about, but see, you've just told me something very valuable, which is when we're talking about tree removal and tree mitigation in the code, we're talking in terms of caliper.
Mhm.
So that sounds to me like that's wrong.
It is. That's why I've got my hand raised.
I mean, it is and
It's wrong. It's wrong.
it is and it isn't.
All right,
I mean,
so-
I'm measuring them at a foot.
Okay.
That's not to say that's
But,
wrong.
so,
No, it
would
doesn't.
we be able to, Liz, and I realize this departs from industry terminology,
Mhm.
but if we were drafting a law that said that with respect to certain things, we're talking about the circumference of a tree at a certain height,
Circumference?
excuse me, diameter.
No, some people have DC measurements.
No, no,
of
no, no, no,
circumference.
I had that issue once.
Okay.
With the
Oh,
building
yeah.
inspector, I never want to go there again. If we said in the code, instead of using DBH and caliper, we said that on certain matters, the tree's diameters, we're talking about trees that at a certain height, the diameter is X. And for certain other matters, we're talking about a tree's diameter at a height of Y. Would we be able to remove the confusion and the industry terminology and have something very clear cut for members of the public? And you could then take that and use that in your industry conversations with the nursery versus the maintenance crew. But for purposes of drafting a code, just write it that simply.
Say it again, how you wanna write the code?
That we wouldn't use either of those terms, but we would just say with respect to certain things, we're talking about the diameter of a tree at so many inches above the ground. And with other things, we're talking about the diameter of a tree at so many more inches above the ground.
I think
So
you
eliminate
either-
DBH and eliminate the term caliper.
Yeah, boy, I want to hear what
Yeah.
I think you either leave it as it is now, where you just measure everything at a foot, or you use the correct terms. I think saying diameter is just gonna create more confusion, honestly. Because we're writing for the code for really three different things. We have landscapers, homeowners, and tree companies.
And city officials who
Well,
enforce it.
You don't have to worry about me knowing the difference between
No,
diameter.
no.
But-
But we do need to worry that you are able to read something the same way a member of the public is reading it,
But that's
Yeah.
the
so
With
that it
no
gets
discretion.
applied fairly
Yeah.
and reasonably to the
Clear cut.
homeowner, the property owner.
So let me jump in, because I see this in very simple terms. I think it's gonna appeal to Sturgis, it's gonna appeal to Susan, and that is, if you're taking the tree out, it's a DBH. If you're putting a tree in, it's a caliper. And, I mean, I agree that those terms are the industry terms. The guys that are actually pulling it out need to know that. The guys that are putting the tree in, the guy that's the landscaper, whoever it is that's buying the tree to put it in, those are the terms they understand. I think they're valid terms. I think they should be in there, but they're clear distinction. And I recognize that DBH might apply to some other issues beyond just pulling it out, but not putting it in. Yeah, and I mean, it's
Our
as far as I'm
purpose.
concerned, it's that basic.
Our purpose, it really, I mean, on the surveys, we'll have to have the surveyors redo how they survey trees, because they're surveying them at a foot. But I mean, we have what, 3 survey companies? That's not
Why would they do it that way? Why wouldn't they use DBH?
because we've told them we need it at a foot.
Oh.
Because they've been doing it for so long.
All
Just-
right.
Well, I'll tell you, because the statute says the caliper, the diameter of a tree trunk is measured at 12 inches above the ground. That's what the code says.
Can I ask a question real quick? What would, just playing devil's advocate here. What would happen if you went to a nursery and said, I need a tree that in 10 years is gonna have a 20-foot canopy?
They'd say, where are you planting it? How much room is it? How well are you gonna take care of it?
Okay.
How
So-
well is it
Yeah,
gonna
but
be
she's just-
watered? Are you gonna prune it? Are
You're
you
just
gonna
buying a
fertilize
tree.
it?
You want a tree that's gonna have a
I'm
canopy.
talking
of 20
about
feet.
the gist of the tree ordinance is to keep the canopy,
Yeah,
and we still are stuck on okay, I'm gonna give you a perfect example. I actually took pictures, because I spent Monday up at Georgetown University in DC, and I actually took a picture, because it was one of the biggest trees I'd ever seen in my life. There was one tree. Have you been to Georgetown University?
Oh,
Oh my
yeah.
God, if you wanna see trees, you need to go see trees, okay? But I took a picture of this tree, and I told my daughter to stand in front of it, because I was just so amazed, and I said, you know what? If that were in Rehoboth, and that tree died, and you had to cut it down, you would literally have to plant 1,000 trees to make up for the DBH of this tree. It had to be 5 foot. So again, the canopy, there's one tree, and I thought it was one tree in this middle of this field, the canopy had to be 80 foot, maybe 100, it was incredible. So if that were in Rehoboth and that tree fell over, what would our code say we had to do?
It got storm damage?
Or it just, they say it has to be replaced. Somebody wants, it has to be replaced, like the one on the corner of Sussex Street right now that they're tearing down, or chopping down, or whatever they're doing to it.
Cleaning up storm damage, well,
Yeah.
not storm, but.
There's not much
failed-
left of that
yeah,
poor thing.
failed
But
branches.
what would happen, and the only reason I'm saying this is because a lot of the trees in Georgetown were actually, the trees were the site. Everything was encapsulated. You just said 65 square feet. There's a tree that, oh my God, it's massive, and there's no way it has 65 square feet around it. It's crazy how small this thing is, and it's raised 3 foot off the ground, and the sidewalks aren't buckling. I was like, where's the roots? What's holding this thing up?
Well,
So-
there's a lot
Yeah.
of different systems.
Yeah,
that you
so
can-
I mean, I get all that, but I'm just saying, at that point, I wouldn't want to replace that with any caliber or any TBH tree. I would want to put one tree back that hopefully in 20 years is going to look just like that tree we took out. And I think that's what our code, again, is still missing.
Description of your tree, that's not a 20-year-old tree.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a
Well,
100.
Well, it's a
100-year-old.
100-year-old tree. Well, I'm saying even the ones they have encapsulated. So again, I'm going back to the intent
Susan,
of the code.
I will tell you how it
And-
works right now.
Yeah.
If you take down a tree, which I had the experience with, it's 3.5 feet in diameter.
Right.
You have to plant 15 trees.
Depending
Right.
on, but you're missing the key point. It depends on what else you have on your lot. So a lot of times, people take down big trees. So the one you're thinking about on the corner of Sussex and Worth, it's a gigantic tree, but I haven't been out there to look for a permit, but I know they have other trees on the lot.
Right.
So
But again,
that's the whole
the only
point
reason
of
I'm bringing this
mitigation.
up is if we went to a system of canopy versus a system, we're spending all this time on caliper and DBH. If we went to the intent of the code, which is to have a canopy, should there be a different measurement completely that makes those two terms not as relevant?
Purely speculative.
Okay?
Can it be a word that's gonna be purely speculative? Is there? an
That's what I'm
objective
saying,
way to
is
make it?
there, we know what caliper is, it's a new tree. We know what DBH is, it's a planted tree, okay? But again, I could plant a pine tree that has a canopy of, 10 foot. I could plant an oak tree that has a canopy of 40 foot. Where are you trying to get with it? And should there be another definition going in there? And will that change what you're saying about simplifying it to one?
Have you guys relatively agreed on it's gonna be based on the size of the tree removed, the number of trees replanted, like remove
we
one?
have none.
No, I think it should
I
be
think
based on the
this-
canopy.
You need to figure that out. That's like the main premise for this.
Step
This is all
one.
new. Yeah, this is
Okay.
all.
And,
That's why we need,
Side.
that's why we need your math.
yeah, so,
So what would you prefer? Would you
Well-
prefer a bunch of trees or would you prefer a big canopy from
Well-
one or two trees?
It's a mixture, because there is a whole field of consulting arboriculture where they value a tree. So you'll see lawsuits, lawyers find that interesting, about what is the value of this tree my neighbor came and removed my tree without my consent. I'm gonna sue him, what's my tree worth? And there's all different ways to calculate that value. At the base of it, it's the size of the trunk. You might incorporate canopy spread and health and location, all those play a role when you're estimating that value. But at the very most basic thing, they do a replacement. You take, say, a 30-inch tree, and the largest tree we can find in a nursery in the state is, let's say, 5 inches. You take the cost of the 5-inch tree plus the transport install, and you take that times 6, and that is what your 30-inch tree is worth. And I think that's where our tree code was based off of. Whether or not that's appropriate, I can't tell, it's one way in which to measure.
I would say the value has nothing to do with that at all, but it would have to do with the appraisal of the property beforehand and afterwards.
See, I mean, there's a million, but right at the base, there's 3 different ways they calculate generally the value of a tree. That's one of them, the simplest. But it takes into account location. So if it's a front yard tree setback from the house that added 5% to the value of the home value is now reduced, they'll factor that in. But at the very base, the replacement cost is what you go with.
I mean, there's another, I'm thinking about Brian Patterson's PowerPoint presentation that he showed you, and he had a chart in there that gave the value of trees, and part of what the planning commissioner, he had acquired was the value of a tree based on its, I think, ability to mitigate stormwater and possibly to shade pavement so that it doesn't have to be replaced as frequently. So, you know,
go to the tree benefit calculator.
tree benefit calculator.
You can input any tree
Species support.
and
that kind of
size
thing.
and location, and it'll give you an estimated, like stormwater inception, how many
Yeah,
gallons of
yeah.
stormwater it takes in, I mean, how much it contributes to storing carbon, all that type of stuff, your environmental values.
Liz, who developed that?
That was Arbor Day Foundation and Davy Tree experts.
Oh, so it was
The Davy Tree
unique- It was
people?
unique for Rehoboth Beach.
No, it's anybody, you could log right on now and go on. If you wanna see how many gallons of stormwater your front yard tree soaks in, you can go input
Could-
3-inch hornbeam, residential setting, here's my zip code, it drinks 500 gallons a year, whatever.
Can you give that site to the committee so we can look at that?
Yeah, it's actually really, I mean, I don't know for the purposes of this, but it actually is interesting. Just to satisfy your own curiosity.
Well, it might help us identify, like you're saying, going back to the goal, you know, getting some agreement about what kind of trees and how many we're
Well,
trying to have. on
It
property.
does, so say you put in a crepe myrtle, and then you put in an oak.
Mhm.
The crepe myrtle will have minimal value even at a small size. And then it also gives you a projection, like if you take care of this tree 10 years from now, your values will increase to X dollar amount.
And why does the crepe myrtle have minimal?
Because it doesn't absorb as much water, it doesn't shade as much, it doesn't support as much wildlife, it doesn't store as much carbon. I mean, it shows you each number broken down.
So here's a perfect example. I'm going to give you this example, and I'm totally within my right doing this. I've already checked it out. But on, so Liz, before you come looking for me, on the Grove property, okay, we're getting ready to put 6 trees on. I'm not digging up the parking lot. I don't own the parking lot, but our parking lots are really ugly. So I'm like, but I'm not putting a tree on it. My landlord will kill me because I'll devalue the property because she's never going to be able to take it down. Okay, so what I did is I have huge horse troughs. Huge horse
Huge
troughs.
what?
Horse troughs that I have.
Oh, okay.
Okay, we have 10 of them. We actually just dug back up after years because they were containing bamboo. But anyway, so I went to a nursery and I said, I want a tree like I'd have in grandmom's backyard because it's grub, that's the theme. I said, what can I get? And I asked, I said, I'm looking for canopy. I'm looking for something big I can have some bird feeders from and make it look like a nice parking lot fast.
Yeah.
And they gave me 2 options because of everything that Liz is saying. How much, it's in a trough, how much water, how much soil, how much this, how much that. And basically, in my budget, crepe myrtle was the only option that I could come up with.
They're great
Okay.
for something like that.
So, but
I love
again,
it.
if I were actually planting, if I was trying to follow our tree code to make my property look better and plant them on there, I couldn't do it.
There's a view.
I could not do it,
In the
correct?
city, the
Because
crepe
I
myrtle's not
literally
even a
would
tree.
never be able to, if somebody else came along and wanted to develop that property with 0 setbacks, they could never take those trees back down,
That's false.
No,
okay?
false.
That is
Yeah,
not,
if you came in and you said, I'm putting up a restaurant and it's gonna cover the whole lot, then all the trees will come
You're
down.
in commercial.
okay, what if it were a residential property, however?
If you came in and you said this tree is in the center of the lot and I'm building my house here, then the tree will come out.
Okay.
The conflict gets more around the residential on like a front walkway curving to take out a 30-inch oak, or this freebie front yard porch that's now in the path of a 37-inch oak,
Right.
or the overdig on the basement, but not really a basement, that now requires the removal of a 28-inch pine.
But if we
Those
take it
are
out,
the-
we're going back to the mitigation thing with
Depending
the,
on the size of the tree.
depending on the size of the
So-
tree, the mitigation thing, not the canopy that came out from doing it, the size of the actual tree.
The size of the trunk measured at 12 inches, so if it's over, with the exception of like a dogwood, holly, and a cedar, if it's over 24 inches, then you're gonna have mitigation to deal with.
Okay, all right.
So I still have.
I'm getting one more thing I was gonna add to this.
Okay, go ahead.
Assuming, and again, this is, this is an unusual situation, but at that point, I am gonna buy a caliper tree. I'm gonna plant it in a trough.
Mhm.
And then it will be the DBH measured from 3 foot above the ground by the time we get the thing in the planter in the soil. So a calculation, correct? Isn't that how you would measure the caliper of that tree at some?
No.
I mean, I
Future
wouldn't
point?
count it unless it
Or
was
the-
planted,
right,
like for our
okay.
purposes, unless it's physically
You're not in the ground.
planted
In the
on the
ground,
property.
yeah, right.
So what?
Container trees don't count, is what you're saying.
No.
All right, and so what about trees that are raised up, like the trees at Georgetown that have the big thing around them and they're already 3 foot above the ground?
I don't know what you, I'd have to see it, honestly.
Okay. All right,
I'm not sure what you mean.
all right. That gets back to the slope calculation and the argument of using the ANSI code, because that does give you definitions on how to determine if it's based on slope or if it's built up or if it's,
And
Yeah.
I still, I would like to thank Hoyte for writing such good draft minutes, which we'll come back to before the end of the meeting. But at the last meeting, I said the following, and I'm reading from the minutes. We should not focus on the inches of caliper of the removed tree and a required number of caliper for the replacement tree. Rather, mitigation should be concerned with the type of tree removed, height and canopy potential at maturity or after a set number of years, and the type of tree proposed as replacement. And the replacement should be of a similar type and of similar potential for growth and provision of canopy as the removed tree.
hence my long drawn-out grub trough story.
Is that a definition?
Crepe myrtle's not
You
ideal.
could make it into one. It wouldn't be a definition, that would be part of your mitigation section.
No, that part I understand.
And that's where we were last meeting, and now
I know.
we're right back to
I want to thank you
defining
for
safe.
properly recording this.
There you go.
Chairman?
Oh,
All right.
Go ahead, Hoyt.
So, this was supposed to be a short meeting today. And we still have another issue to go, and we really haven't gotten into any meat on the definitions page. I'd like to spend, if we can, if you could just walk through the list and say, I don't like this one's good, whatever, real quick, and Liz, if you can jump in, as needed on this as well, because I do want to get into this.
I'm gonna interject here, I don't see the benefit to us continually hashing out definitions. We haven't decided on one of those
Okay.
basic tenets of how we're
Alright.
mitigation is one of the main factors in this tree code, right?
Thank you.
Yeah,
I
agree.
don't understand, because some of these definitions may be moot points. So then we spent 30
Okay.
minutes discussing what a small specimen tree is, and we've now eliminated it.
yeah, all right,
So,
I accept.
I mean, it's a suggestion, I just think
Yeah.
time would be better spent deciding how we want to require replacements.
There you go.
And does it really matter if we're measuring at 12 inches, 4.5? That's a detail that needs to be hashed out, but are we gonna go by the size of the tree removed, of the trunk, Are we gonna somehow determine some new way to calculate canopy coverage and height? And we're gonna have to buy a $5,000 tool so I can shoot lines and measure the height of the tree? I mean, well, that's what it would require. I can't go out and just estimate a height.
I think what she just said is where we started, or at least what I was starting at a while ago, is we gotta.
We gotta decide what
Proper
goal
order.
we're trying to
Yeah.
satisfy. Everything else flows from that.
And I think I think we're all in agreement, right, that we're talking more about quality over quantity.
Yes,
Amen.
Absolutely.
Coverage over 75 hornbeams.
yes,
Absolutely.
Now,
Yes.
hornbeams have their place, crepe myrtles have their place.
yes. A tree that's gonna live over a tree that's gonna die. A
Or
tree that's something
a
that's put in
tree-
just to meet a code versus something that is going to give the people the granny tree that they're looking for.
Every tree has an appropriate spot. For you, the crepe myrtles are appropriate in a trough. Maybe on the corner of a property so it doesn't affect the view, a crepe myrtle would be appropriate. In the middle of a 1,000-square-foot backyard, a crepe myrtle will look silly.
They're not even in, are they in your specimen list now, crepe myrtles?
Not allowed to be planted because they're not native, but if it's an existing crepe myrtle that already meets the definition of a tree, then yeah,
Okay.
we'll count in favor of it.
Mayor's backyard.
Right,
So I think we need to decide what we're gonna do for minimum density. If it's gonna stay 3 trees, if it's gonna go to 2, if we're gonna eliminate the small specimen and just say 2 canopy trees, and how we're gonna require replacements.
great.
All right, Coach.
I just bursted your bubble, Hoyt, now you're in big trouble, we gotta start all over again.
There you go.
It's not starting all over.
Right.
No,
Could
I
I just ask a favor? Just, one of the things, I'm having a hard time keeping everything straight. And we're real good at putting, I think we're real good at putting the part of the code, but what I'm missing is the author of the revision and the date that it's done. And I'm just that would help me a whole lot in terms of organizing. Because I'm
What
not.
do you have a suggestion?
Well, I think anytime any of us writes anything and sends it out, it ought to have who we are and what date we did it.
They're all Word documents, right?
I've actually done that.
I know, yeah.
They're all Word.
I'm just saying that I'm not sure it always gets done,
Let me just show you.
and then I have a really,
See,
Do
right
it in
right there.
okay,
That's the date.
I know, but
That's the issue.
I got it,
Okay? And so,
but I don't always know, I mean, then going back, I don't know, it would just be helpful for me if it was more prominently displayed, kind of
put it
who-
at the beginning
who it-
instead of.
Yeah, the
oh,
date
okay.
and who's doing it, because
So-
I'm just asking, I don't know if other people would.
I think it's
Be
more
helpful.
appropriate in that's how we do like our permits and stuff when we edit them, it goes in the footer. So it'll be
In the-
date,
in
the
the
date,
And,
yeah, in a footer, like a header, and we always have a header and a footer because we have the city seal at the
Okay.
top, so we always put ours in the footer, and it'll
Okay.
have the date and the, sometimes all,
is it on the first page or the last page?
every. So if it's
Oh,
on
it's
a
on
footer-
every page.
Every
So if it's
single
a-
page.
I mean, you can put it in the header, but just that way it automatically, goes on every page.
I mean,
Okay, well, there's, I mean,
that's
while
a
we're.
good organizational topic
Yeah.
of conversation.
Not
Why
to say
don't
you
you
can't put it.
give
at
it
the
some
top.
thought and maybe come back to us for a future meeting?
Well, yeah, to me, that sounds like a technical thing. I'm just
Yeah, no,
thinking,
go
I'm
for
just
it.
thinking while we're
Go for it.
doing this drafting and talking to one
Yeah.
another, it would just be helpful to me if we had names and dates.
I
on
don't
things.
disagree with you. All right,
Thanks, thank you.
so may I move on?
Please go
And
Why doesn't
think-
each of us just send Hoyt an email saying, here are the sections that we think we have drafted to provide to the committee, and he can make a list?
I thought we were already doing that.
Yeah, but I mean, so you
Not
can
yet.
make a list.
Not yet, not yet. I mean, if that's what you want to do, go for it. I'm gonna be overwhelmed here if we get much deeper into this thing. I'm just, I can't cope with it. Okay?
I've got to go soon because I got 35 people coming over tonight. to watch
Oh, okay,
fireworks.
yeah, that's right, you told me that before. So I wanna note that I am gonna come back to our approval of minutes, item number 3 on the agenda, after we get done with our old business item B1 zoning code, and specifically the concept of converting a criminal sanction to a civil penalty. And I want to start off by saying that Gene's done work on this previously. He dealt with two issues in the zoning code, 270.69 and 270. I can never remember this, it's either 83 or 84. Within the last month or so, the Board of Commissioners has taken up the topic of one of them, 270.69, and it's specifically about signs. I'm looking at Susan when I say that.
Don't look at me.
And they have put this on their agenda for the next regular meeting as a public hearing to take input, comments on the concept of limiting it to a civil penalty with a $100 fine associated with it. And I guess my question is, do we believe that's adequate? And then beyond 270.69, further consideration of the second part of that, which is the broader application to other zoning code provisions. Again, do we want to address that in
Well, Hoyte, could you tell us exactly what the Board of Commissioners did at their June 21st meeting?
Because the newspaper made it sound like it was already a done deal.
Yeah.
The Board of Commissioners actually passed several other elements, penalty provisions in other provisions of the code, of the general code. And to answer your question, Sandy, no, I can't, but my recollection is there was like 4 or 5 other issues, and I can't remember exactly what they were, but they changed the provisions in those code sections to allow the assistant building inspector, the compliance officer, whatever he's called, to use a civil penalty system for enforcing the problems. But because it's in the zoning code, there needs to be, the zoning code requires a public hearing process, so that part of it has not been.
According to this, it says Rehoboth Commissioners voted unanimously in favor of the changes, and it's already in effect that they'll start writing tickets instead of.
That's correct. That's correct.
So.
But it doesn't affect Part 270.69 signs. There needs to be a public hearing before that one can be adopted. Am I answering your question? Yes, the mayor would like to.
If I can
Sure,
reiterate
please.
what we did.
Yeah.
I think there were 5 situations that Dennis mentioned, and I don't remember the 4, but the 5th was a zoning thing for signs, so
Right.
that had to be separated.
Right.
As an example of what we did was, basically, Dennis, as the code enforcement officer, walking around town, and you see someone's yard that's 18 inches of grass, and you're supposed to cut it. Basically, he couldn't go and just, write out a citation. He'd give a warning, whatever. But he'd have to go to the police, and the police would write a citation, and it would be a criminal situation. And so what he's trying to do is take out the police and say, hey, let me do it. I'll give them a warning, and then maybe I'll give them a $100 ticket because they didn't do it again. And so for those 4, that's what it was. The 270.69, because it has to do with zoning, we would have done the same thing, except you have to have a public hearing to change or amend anything in zoning. And so that's what's going on. And so that change is only for signs because that's part of his job. And then, for other things, well, if the business building code or whatever would be a different step. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody have?
So based on that, so they've come up with something right now that it's a $100 fine for a certain thing. All right, so going back to what I was saying a while ago, if if penalties is a section of the code, we could say that's a infraction A. So in our tree ordinance, doing something, she might say is gonna be an infraction C, and the penalty starts at 500, instead of listing it in each code. You see what I'm saying? So give a name to what they just did. And then we can say, instead of sitting here figuring out, should it be this, should it be that, should it be this, just say, we're gonna call cutting, cropping a tree or topping a tree an infraction A. And then people just, you know what I mean? We're not figuring out, is it $50, is it $100, you have to do this. They've already set up one precedent for something.
I think you mentioned this at the last meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
we just
let me-
take the
let me
first
respond to
one,
that.
and now if we're trying to figure out with the tree how
So-
we're gonna do the process,
I
let's
hate to
just
sound
call it
like a
something.
broken record, but I've looked at this a little bit. There are, and I'm going to get to this again further, depending on what Gene has to say. There are at least 55 penalty provisions in our general code. 55,
Yeah.
okay? And so your suggestion is well taken. It would be interesting to be able to have one provision, and it could be embodied in chapter 120, is it 126, Gene? That deals with civil penalties. They could enumerate, if we're, we have provisions in the code that identify specific parking meters and the extent of the time that they're gonna be in operation and, how much the fee is gonna be for these things. Why aren't we doing that for penalties? So I'm totally with what you're talking about here, but again, it's the broken record. This is above our pay grade. This should be done by some professional code writers. So my question, as it relates specifically to 270.69, is: do we, as a committee, want to make a statement at this public hearing about how we believe that particular provision should be addressed? And now I'm going to turn to Gene for that answer.
Actually, it's apples and oranges. What we were originally proposing had to do with the entire zoning code. This only has to do with one section of the zoning code.
I agree. I'm going to get to 270.83 in a minute.
I don't think I'm certainly for what they're doing.
Okay.
I just want to go much further,
Okay.
which I don't think they can do at the meeting because they've already advertised it.
But Gene,
Okay.
as a committee, and because you have worked so much on this point, do you still want the committee, and it could be you or Hoyte, because the two of you have been involved in this the most, to be at that meeting to say to the commissioners that the Law Oversight Committee has considered this one section in the broader context of
That's
the
really my
whole
question.
criminalization of,
Yeah.
or decriminalization, excuse me, of sanctions under the zoning code?
I have no problems with that.
Okay.
I don't believe I have a copy of this.
Of
Did
which?
I miss it? Of the sign piece. I don't.
Which
I
sign
mean,
piece?
Of
The
what
one
Gene
we're
did?
talking about what Gene did. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't think
I'll
I have.
have to
Several
get-
meetings ago.
I'll have to get that to you. Oh, it was a long time ago.
I think that's,
It's
Over years.
well before you took
I kind of missed
the chair.
it. Well, you asked a question about whether we thought a penalty of a certain fine was sufficient before, and I didn't have that in front of me, and I didn't have a way to,
Gene's
is that
provision
something
was
you still want us to?
not
vote
that
on?
specific. He
Oh,
didn't call for any specific dollar amount per
Okay.
fine.
so,
But I'll get you a copy.
okay, I just,
This is not the end of this conversation. So Gene, moving on to the other provision, 270.83. This is a question we raised previously, and Julie Davis had concerns that it was not going far enough as you had altered it
I think
to
she
leave
still,
the
she
door
still
ajar
wanted to have
for
people
criminal.
handcuffed and hauled off to jail.
Sorry?
I think she just wanted people to continue to be hauled off to jail.
Yeah, right. Um, Well, your thought on it, though?
Can I interrupt you guys? Have you moved on? Are we done with
You,
A?
oh, I'm so
And I
sorry.
can,
I'm
good
so
to go,
sorry.
no more
Yeah.
questions? Okay.
Yeah.
I was just checking
We're
to
done
make
with
sure
trees.
you weren't coming back around to it.
No, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine.
I'm so sorry.
All right, see you.
Thank you. Have a nice holiday.
You too.
So Gene, if you're standing firm on just leaving that as you had originally drafted it?
Well, I haven't considered it in light of what they've done recently.
Well, I'm not, now I'm on 83. I'm not,
But we've never presented that to them, have we?
no, I'm not gonna comment on that one. Yeah, that's good you found
I guess if the committee hasn't had a chance to really argue about it or discuss it, perhaps we shouldn't say anything to the commissioners other than in our individual capacities.
Yeah, again, I'm sorry, I'm maybe not making myself clear. With respect to 270.69, the sign provision, I'm satisfied we've made a consensus decision not to do anything further based on your comments. But my next step, going to the other provision, 270.83, I continue to be interested, and I know Julie's not on the committee any longer, but I still have some interest in seeing that opportunity to use the final hook, or whatever you want to call it, for a criminal sanction when the civil penalty provision is not achieving the desired goal.
I think that's there.
I'm sorry?
I think that's already there in
Do
section
you feel it's there? I mean, that
123.
I keep missing that, how that
It's
plays
at
out.
the-
It's
at
in
the-
126, correct?
At the end of 126.
At the end of
At the end of it, it says, this does not preclude going to get to the alderman and getting an injunction, which could lead to criminal penalties separately.
Okay. All right.
It just doesn't go to
So-
criminal penalties.
So I
Right, right.
accept that. I accept that. I accept that. Does anybody else have any lingering concerns about that matter? In spite of the fact you don't have the paperwork?
I just,
I'll give you an option to come back after you've read it.
Okay.
There you go.
I just didn't like the idea originally when I brought it up of having somebody hauled off to jail or to get a criminal citation because of digging up a bush in the front yard or replacing
The rocks.
a rock.
Right.
In one case,
Right.
exactly.
I hear you.
And the police didn't particularly like the idea of having to go around and do that either.
I'm sure. Sure. Well, it's just like the grass. You know, they don't do that. All right, so as far as I'm concerned, this is a done deal. You know, we can move forward. We can actually draft something and send it to the Board of Commissioners, giving them our position on this thing and recommending that they consider action to make a change in 270.83 to decriminalize the.
And I'm probably gonna do that personally anyway.
Well, so what I would like to do is, and again, I'm gonna give Sturgis a shot at this. Ask you, or I'm not gonna ask you at this point, but I'm gonna give her another shot at this. I'm gonna take another look at the provision itself and what you've provided to us. And then I'll probably come back to you before a future meeting, he said, to ask you to do something formal that we could then pass on to the Board of Commissioners. Okay? All right. Anybody else have anything to say about that? Thank you. We're getting out of here. All right, so if I may, I would like to go back to our third agenda item. And based on conversation with Sandy Bieber, I have identified the fact that certain suggested changes that Sandy made have been incorporated in the minutes you have before you. However, in each set of minutes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the changes that I had proposed, in fact, are incorporated. There are two typographical where there were comments on, you gotta fill something in or whatever that.
And so I'm gonna identify those, and then ask for a motion in a second.
I have an addition, Hoyt. I sent you a comment on the last item on page 3, and
Which set of
Okay, wait a
minutes?
second.
I'm sorry, the minutes for June 5th.
Okay.
And I was not clear when I brought this one to your attention. I believe I, rather than Sandy, recommended that member preparing suggested changes be responsible for revisions rather than.
Right.
I'm glad to give that honor.
You'll
to
give
Sturgis.
that one up?
You bet.
All right, so, is that, where are you? Right there.
Very end.
So I'm gonna show,
I wasn't at the meeting at that hour.
there you go. Yes, forgive me,
That's
you did
okay.
send me that. All right.
So while you're in those same minutes.
More?
No, at the beginning, I just asked the question of whether we should always be indicating that Ann is present or not present.
Oh, so let me address that if I may.
Yes.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce my request for a motion and a second. And I'm going to start with, if I may, the March 6th set of minutes. And in those minutes, which you have received, there is one typo that I would like to correct on page 2 under new business, A zoning code, item number 1, paragraph 2. And the second sentence of that contains a parenthetical phrase, which I would like to delete and substitute the following. I will read that portion of the sentence existing. There was also a meeting, and I will then add, comma, attended by Hoyte Decker, comma, with continuing on, with Chief Building Inspector Don Molina, ...
Got it.
Okay? Everybody clear on that? All right, and then,
So you want a motion on those minutes?
I'm gonna ask, well, do you want me to do it separately? I'll do it separately. No? I think when we get done, it'll be easier. All right, I'm now moving on to the minutes for June 5, meeting June 5. And under the roll call section, which is on the first page, it's actually the first substantive item, there again is a parenthetical phrase which I am intending to delete. And I will explain that it calls for discussion about the role and/or the presence of the city secretary. And I would intend to bring that up as a matter of discussion, probably under organization, at a time when the city secretary is present. She's on vacation right now. Okay? I have a second edit to make on the last page, page 3 of this document, in the last paragraph of, wherever it is, old business item B2, and all the way at the end, the last paragraph of that section, it starts off with the word finally, comma, and I'm substituting the words Sturgis Dodge, the person's name, in place of a erroneous name that I used when I drafted the minutes. So with that, may I please have a motion and
I have
maybe
one
a
thing
second?
before that. I'm sorry, I missed when you sent this out, the first thing. And it's on the bottom part. It says.
Where are you? What set of minutes, please?
I'm on the date you're talking about, June 5th.
Okay,
Okay, down the bottom, or it starts.
page one.
Page, no, under old business, under tree ordinance, B2, all the way down the bottom of the page.
Okay. Oh,
Where it says.
Susan Wood described?
Yep, and then so she went on to say, to achieve a wooded seaside character of Hope Beach, you may need to limit the size of houses to permit larger trees. That was, if I did say it that way, it should say footprint.
Should say,
Footprint of houses.
okay, can you tell me specifically, can you
Yeah.
read the sentence and at the point where you want me to substitute language, please advise me.
She went on to say, to achieve a wooded seaside character of Rehoboth Beach, you may need to limit the footprint.
Oh, I thought that was referring to Sturgis's comments.
No, that was, or was that your comments?
Well,
I
if
thought
you
I
didn't,
said that.
if you didn't say it, I very well might have, but.
Oh, I thought I said
You might
that,
have said that.
because we were talking
I
about,
don't recall.
I'm pretty sure it was Sturgis when I listened to the video.
oh, it was, okay, well then, leave it alone. Because when I talked about it, I was talking about the footprint and not counting basements, or not allowing basements, so that the houses could have the same square footage, but maybe I'm going back a few meetings up. We've talked about it so many times. Okay, that's cool.
All right, so
As
you're
long as you
withdrawing
said
the
that, not
correction.
me.
You're withdrawing the correction?
Yes, I'm withdrawing
All
my
right,
correction.
Thank you. Again, I'm asking for a motion and a second.
Second.
Did I hear a motion?
I think Sandy did.
Oh, did you motion?
I'll be glad to, sir.
Thank you. I missed it. Okay, so we have a motion and a second?
Second.
Thank you.
All right.
All right, so, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? You did it. All right, hang on one second, please. So, the next meeting is scheduled for August 7. Again, I'm going to ask if we could start the meeting. It's scheduled for 10, but I'm going to ask if we could start it at 9 with the hope of getting out of here at around noon, as we're trying to do today. Is there any concern with that? May I put it down as 9 o'clock?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, so unless there is good of the order, anybody else have any comments they want to make at this point? Getting you out of here by noon. I'm calling this meeting adjourned at 11:52. Thank you guys very much. Enjoy your holiday.
Thank you, sir.
Sorry I was late, I pulled into the parking lot over here. I didn't realize you had to pay meters for this parking lot for City Hall as well.
You don't if you're here at a public meeting.
Put a sign in your
Put a little
windshield.
note and says-
Oh,
that
jeez,
says
I
you're at a
pulled in
public
and I was
meeting.
like, I don't have any quarters and I didn't know, so it was like, it ran all, that's why.
I mean, we had that conversation.
We
with-
had
we-
it
I didn't
last time,
realize it.
And if we,
And I
Are
pulled
we
in and
off
I
the
parked
air?
and I was
How do you
walking and I
turn
was
this
like,
off?
Oh,
oh,
no, we're
man.
not. I mean,
I
here
gotta
we,
drive back
I
to
don't know how to do
Rochelle.
this. I mean,
we're
unless we
still
wave at the
recording,
guy.
so I would suggest
Oh.
that you be,
I'm gonna go talk to the
Yeah.
girl over at the counter there to have a show.
Sturgis,
Yes.
can I show you something now that
Yes.
we're done?
You're still on. Guys, I gotta go.
Okay, Susan, good
Thank
to
you,
see you.
Susan.
All right,
Did you get my note?
let me know if I can help.
Yeah.
I have very
Yeah.
limited
We're
time,
gonna be doing
obviously,
that. She
this
can- we're
month,
good.
but,
38,
okay,
39.
Okay, see, I haven't had a
Yeah,
chance
yeah,
to
yeah.
look at it.
I will
So-
send you this, I found this in my notes, so that you have some
okay.
sign.
Oh, super, super, thank you.
So, but now I,
Did you just give her that?
no,
No,
I'm
he
gonna,
said he
just gonna
said he's
scan
gonna-
it and send it to her.
Oh, okay, that's cool.
I'm not giving her my only.
No, no, I wasn't asking you that. There we go.
All right,
Hey,
so-
Max.
I love scanning.
Good, you shouldn't have